Good evening, everyone. I'm Cale Royer with treestuff.com. Welcome to our webinar on Tree Risk Assessment Qualification. Thanks everyone for joining us from wherever you are. Also good, I guess it would be probably good very late evening for our viewers in Lithuania. Also, I'm glad that you like the new music. There's no copyright infringement on this if we use it, so this is what we've got now. I really like it. Hope you guys like it too. We're going to get started here in a second with Casey. He's got a great presentation for you. First, I've got a couple little things that I want to run through. Just some business things, because I do work for Tree Stuff, and you got to know this stuff. What's coming up next? May 8th, we have our first Tree Stuff party for in a year. That's going to be in Wisconsin with Jason Dudek, great guy, Tree Stuff superfan. Head out to that. Come out anytime. I think it is 10 a.m. to 2 or 3 maybe, off the top of my head. Go to our Facebook page, events section, and you can find all the information there, the address. There's a little map he's got to point you in the right direction. There's going to be gear that you can try out there. They're a lot of fun. A lot of local arborists come out to that. Bring your kids, bring all your friends, your guys from work. It's great, and you'll leave as Jason's newest best friend. That's just how it works. So we're starting up Tree Stuff parties again. If you want to host a Tree Stuff party, go ahead and send me an email at media@treestuff.com if you'd like to volunteer, and you'll get in touch with myself, and I'll vet you, make sure you're cool, and you're good to host a party. The next webinar that we have coming up is June 10th. That is tree fertilization and plant health care for beginners with Trent Dix. He's done a lot of plant health care webinars with us. So it's going to be really, really informational. He knows a lot of stuff about soil health and plant health and all that. So that's going to be great. Great webinar there. And then after that, July 15th, we have palm pruning from start to finish with Nick Araya out in LA, Tree Care LA. He is fantastic climber, great business owner, and so he'll show you all that. It's going to be really neat. And otherwise, we have our Fusion 500 promotion going on. Spend $500, use the coupon code Fusion500. You get a free Fusion rope wrench tether, which is really great. We have a lot of videos on that product, explaining how it works and reviews of it. So go check that out. And what else? We've also got Notch Sentry saddles for $50. So if you don't have a saddle, or you know somebody who needs a new saddle or needs a beginner saddle, go ahead and buy 6 of them. Go for it. There's 2 different styles of them. Check that out. That's all at Tree Stuff, right up there on the front page. I've made big graphics for you guys to see that should help you, point you out on where you can find those deals. So without any further ado, I'm going to switch it on over to the main man for the night, and that is Casey Snyder, who's going to tell you all about Tree Risk Assessment Qualification. Casey, over to you.
Hey everybody, thanks for joining on me tonight and checking out this webinar. I'm back. I've done this once before, and this is my basement climbing dungeon. So this is where I keep all my gear. I probably buy way too much stuff on Tree Stuff, but I guess that's not really a bad problem. We're going to be kind of syncing up on my presentation. I have just kind of slides that I'll be going through, talking about tree risk assessment and basically an overview of the course. To start with, just an introduction if you haven't met me or seen me before. I am a certified arborist. I have been since 2015. I took my first tree risk assessment course back in 2017. It's a qualification that lasts for 5 years. So I'll be due again to basically re-up that qualification next year. I'm also a CTSP with the TCIA, and then I am lapsed, but I do have a local Minnesota tree inspector, basically kind of a local version of tree risk assessment in Minnesota. Other states have that too. I think that's a valuable thing to carry as well. I'm pesticide applicator's license, and I've been a tree climber since 2009. So going on almost 11 years, kind of working adjacent to the industry and deeply within the industry now. I started as a nurseryman, so I ran a nursery in South Dakota after going to a tech school for horticulture. I went to South Dakota State after that to kind of get out of that field and to connect with tree industry professionals, which then led me to working with Davey Tree. I've been with Davey Tree for 5 years in different roles as a tree climber, plant healthcare technician. I worked as a foreman, kind of among those roles, and then now I work in our sales and consulting and basically the management of my office as well. I'm also on YouTube, so you guys can find me on there if you ever want to watch some of my videos. And yeah, first thing though, before I move on to like explaining all the TRAQ stuff, I do want to explain that this TRAQ prep webinar that we're doing now it's not intended to take place for the TRAQ course. If anyone's ever taken it before, if you plan to take it, definitely check it out. On this next slide here, I have information about where you can find the tree risk assessment application. Each presentation or class is going to have a different cost associated with it, so you can either find it through ISA's website or your local ISA chapter's website. ISAarbor.com is where you're going to find that information, but again, this won't make you TRAQ qualified, obviously. It'll just kind of help prep you for that course or add to what you already know about tree risk assessment. Moving on to the goals for this webinar, basically, I've kind of explained some of them already, but I want to explain what TRAQ is and how it can improve your work as an arborist. I want to provide some definitions and examples of TRAQ-specific terms, techniques, and scenarios. And then I kind of got my own little tidbit I want to add that's, I think, encompasses a lot of basically any education that you want to take part in as an arborist, being a practical arborist to me and how we function in the industry. Then I also want to provide an overview of the TRAQ course and the expectation. And hopefully inspire more certified arborists to become TRAQ or local area tree inspectors. I think it's a really valuable qualification and worth the time and the expense. So moving on, what is TRAQ? So I think when I first took the TRAQ course, I really didn't know anything about it. It was something that my boss was really kind to sign me up for that. And I'm super lucky because I didn't really go into it with any expectations or, all I knew is I needed a few materials and to show up for a class. And so I think there's like a double-edged sword with this qualification. It's either seems like it's too much or you don't really need it. It's like it's more than what you need. You just have your ISA certification. That's good enough. But this really does add to your certification. And then there's also the other edge of that sword where it's like, well, this doesn't really seem worth my time. There's not really anything extra value that I can get out of this. So there could be, that feeling of like it's not really worth doing, but I can definitely tell you that I've gotten a lot out of it. On this next slide, I'll just kind of read some information explaining what the TRAQ course is. This is just right from the ISA's website. And the TRAQ program offers tree care professionals the opportunity to expand their knowledge of the fundamentals of tree risk assessment by learning a standardized systematic process for assessing tree risk and providing information to tree owners, risk managers for making informed decisions that will promote the safety of people and property and enhance tree benefits, health, and longevity. So I think this is kind of a nice tidbit because I think as arborists, most of us are already doing these things. The only kind of piece pulled out of there is that standardized systematic process for assessing tree risk. Like we may not have really like a system figured out for that. We just kind of do it, either if you're quoting or if you're just approaching a tree. If you're the guy who has to climb it, you're performing a tree risk assessment every time you look at a tree, figuring out what you have to do to the tree, what's, is that a safe tie-in point? Where should I throw in? Like you're doing all that type of work even before you get in the canopy. So tree risk assessment, this TRAQ name is the qualification, but I think almost anybody involved with tree care is doing tree risk assessment. On the next slide here, we're talking about who can become TRAQ credentialed, and I didn't include all this list because there's so many different people that could become TRAQ qualified. The key thing is you don't have to be an ISA certified arborist to do so. I mean, of course, you're basically automatically qualified to become credentialed if you're a master arborist, regular certified arborist. The TRAQ qualification, you need to do a renewal or a refresher. Even online at the ISA website, I did a refresher TRAQ course. I just paid like $20 and spent like 2 hours going through all this material again just to like refresh my brain on it. But even if you just have a degree in, so again, go to the ISA website if you need more information about that. Yeah. Oh, internet on your side? Okay, all right. Just to reiterate, I just want to say that you do not need to be a certified arborist to become TRAQ credentialed. It's very important, but it isn't all, that's definitely something you should probably have. It's the better base of knowledge than just coming in off the street. But yeah, a lot of times you'll have that base of knowledge just from having a tree care or a forestry or arboriculture degree. So on the next slide, I'm just kind of going over, what the course is like and what kind of things you're going to have to deal with when you're taking the course. So there's kind of this whole list of areas of study, and they're basically chapters within the Tree Risk Assessment Manual. It's a smaller book than the ISA certification manual, but it is still a very it's got a lot of good diagrams and pictures and explanations of each of these 1 through 9, obviously introduction, what levels of assessment, the target assessment, site assessment, etc. And the objectives are pretty similar to even what my objectives are, except for a lot more in depth. So your extra tool that you have that I highlighted here is the ISA Best Management Practices, the Tree Risk Assessment book. I have both the physical and the digital copy, and that's really technical information. I think I still like going back to my TRAQ manual for updates, or just using the ISA website for, like, again, a refresher of what tree risk assessment is. But it does become pretty well ingrained in your habits when you're selling work or doing tree risk assessment for a client. Continuing on the next slide, what the course is like. The standard ISA TRAQ course is a 2-day in-person training. Since COVID, I don't know if that's changed or they've postponed it or have like an online version, but the course I went to had maybe 20 people. We were all just basically in a university classroom, and it was run by Mark Dunneman, who is a really good TRAQ arborist. I think he's a master arborist as well. There's really good people doing this course. It was well worth, in person if you can, if it's safe, obviously. And it does look like across the US I've seen current like active classes in registration or even happening like as soon as next week. There's a written exam, there's 100 multiple choice questions, and there's also a performance-based exam where you actually, after you learn tree risk assessment, you go out and look at a tree. Everyone looks at the same tree, and you do, a standardized form of tree risk assessment. There is obviously cost with this. I mean, it's a 5-year long credential, and then it's also a 2-day, full day of course, plus a half day where you do the exam. So without being an ISA member, you're looking at $850 to take the course, about $100 off of membership. That price isn't always the same. Sometimes it's a little bit higher, sometimes a little bit less, depending on your chapter or who's running the course. Renewal is a little bit cheaper. So like next year when I do the renewal for it, it'll be about $450. If your boss is really nice, they'll pay for it. But if it's something you want to get for yourself, it's definitely worth the money. Moving on to definitions. So obviously this whole course or this whole webinar is about tree risk assessment. That's kind of the meat and potatoes of it. So let's define tree risk assessment. So tree risk assessment is the process of evaluating the likelihood that I'm sorry, maybe before I continue, Kale, does anyone have any questions about the course details at all?
The only questions that I have currently is about what is your degree in?
Oh, I hate explaining it because I went to a really small agriculture school. So the forestry and horticulture department are in the College of Agriculture. So on my diploma, it says I have a farmer degree. It says Bachelor's of Science in Agriculture. But my studies were woody plant production. So I focused specifically on trees and shrubs in my time. But yeah, technically I just keep that degree hidden in a drawer somewhere because I like to show off my ISA credentials more than my bachelor's degree. So maybe
Gotcha.
someday I'll get a master's degree that like looks cooler.
There you go.
Yeah.
The only other thing I want to say is that I forgot to say at the beginning here. To get your CEUs, you have to watch until the end, and then I'll post a quiz in the comments here. I'll post a link to a quiz that Casey has made that you can take. If you pass that quiz, then we'll send your scores to the ISA, and they will process all that. It takes them a really long time, and then you will have your CEUs. Question here from James Alana. Will the course be offered in Hawaii? Where do you go to find these things out?
Yeah, so it's possible. Just either go to the isa-arbor.com, and it's not the easiest website to navigate, but if you go under I think it's ISA credentialing and then tree risk assessment, then there's a further link to finding an event calendar, and that event calendar will have every listing for that TRAQ course across the US and probably internationally. But you'll just have to find, if Hawaii has their own chapter, I don't know if they do, if it's like a West Coast type of chapter. But you just go to your local chapter that you're an ISA certified arborist in, or if you're not, just try to find that local Hawaii chapter, and they might have an events page specific to what's going on there. Cool. All right. Well, then back to the regular program where we'll talk more about tree risk assessment. So this is obviously the most important piece of this puzzle, is the process of evaluating the likelihood that a tree will fall and cause damage or injury. So that is something that is literally the whole reason why we're doing tree risk assessment. The arborist will perform tree risk assessments to enhance public safety, protect workers on the job site, and promote tree longevity by preventing structural failure. The branches, trunks, and entire trees fall under certain circumstances, fail under circumstances. Tree risk assessment considers three main factors. So this is kind of like the three pieces of the puzzle that I put together when I'm looking at tree risk assessment. So I'm looking for the potential for tree failure. I'm looking at what the site is like, the environment that can contribute to the tree failing, and then what would be damaged. Like, is it just going to be like a bench, or would it be an entire house? Or obviously people are a huge factor in this. What's the target? So the target can be basically, everyone's got a little bit different level of acceptance of risk. So some homeowner might think this little, cat statue on their deck is a super important thing that, one, can't be moved, and two, can't be crushed by a tree. So that's considered when you're thinking about tree risk assessment. Moving on to the next one about failure potential. So this kind of goes back into thinking about the potential for failure. And so that next slide there is talking about the likelihood or part of a tree will break and fail. And as arborists, we become pretty familiar with like what certain trees are like. Like this picture here shows you a catalpa that failed in a storm and it just got wrenched. I mean, basically that tree was totally hollow on the inside. It was just kind of a husk of a live tree. On the outside, fully leafed out, everything fine, no sign of decay. It just basically crunched in on itself when the wind blew it. And that's kind of something I'm familiar with. Like when I'm working with catalpa, I know there's going to be most likely trunk decay and some other stuff going on there from either previous pruning cuts or damage. So when we're evaluating the tree's failure potential, you got a number of factors to consider. So the growth habit. So you might have, like here in Minnesota, we have a lot of these oak groves that are very skinny and narrow. And then within those forest grown oaks, you have these really long, elongated box elders kind of stretching over everywhere to get as much light as possible. And those oaks are going to have a little bit different wood fiber and potential for breaking versus like a box elder that could just completely collapse as it ages. Different resistance to decay, better coat it after you prune it, so there's a lot of things with the different tree varieties, but obviously the growth habit's a major factor, especially when you get really long, elongated branches. That goes back into the quality of branch attachment. So whether it's a nice U-shaped union or that deep V with included bark, some trees have a more likelihood to do that, like in Minnesota. I'm only going to have Midwestern examples, but thinking of silver maples, they're going to have a lot more included bark than maybe a honey locust would. Then we also consider the condition of the root system. In my last tree stuff webinar, I talked about girdling roots and root flares and soil compaction. Like that's a really big piece of my tree risk assessment, is looking around at the bottom of the tree, which I'm only like 5'2", so it's a lot easier for me to deal with the base of a tree than it is the top, especially when I'm just consulting. Then we have the lean of the tree and the trunk, and that's again kind of going back to those really elongated trees that try to grow under other trees. You get a lot of leans. But then we can also know, what's the situation? Is it a new lean? Does it look like the tree was going perfectly straight and at some point it leaned it and then maybe it's growing straight again? Like you can kind of see that either by the base of the tree or just how the tree growth habit is, if there's been any changes either in the grade or there's some construction damage or something like that. And then a really big factor, a lot of times I get called to look at trees after there's been some major construction. Knowing the history of a tree site, like I remember working in St. Paul and trying to help these oaks that like looked like total crap no matter what we did. And, years later after fertilizing them and treating them and taking care of them, we find out like, oh yeah, there used to be a road here right at the base of this tree that we covered up and put dirt and planted grass over. So it's like you don't even know there's asphalt underneath the grass sometimes. It's really weird. So with our ability to predict tree failure, it's super limited. Like we have these TRAQ courses to help us kind of like shore up our ability to understand how a tree could fail. But like, sometimes we just don't know. We have to rely on our training. We can learn in our, how we identify certain characteristics with trees and their associated failures. Structural defects that can lead to failure are not always visible. So, we're sometimes making a guesstimation or best guess into what is going to happen with that tree. With failure potential, we're not even thinking about the targets in this case. So just like if you just put that tree in a vacuum and thought about its potential to fail, that's what we're talking about. So just a little side note on the definition of future failure potential. The next one is all about the targets. And I like the pictures that I have in this because this is like a serious example of a tree failing over a lot of targets. So let's define targets again. So targets are people and or property that could be damaged or injured if the tree failed. And it's just funny when we talk about risk, because if there is no target, then there's actually no damage that could occur. So these trees that fell, there's actually multiple trees that broke in a really bad storm last year. If they were just out in a field and didn't hit anything, then there's no risk and there's no target, so no big deal. But in this case, this is a backyard where like a licensed daycare was, and fortunately the trees failed overnight when no one was around. But the tree and the picture with the staircase there, that just smashed right through the house. And then you can see the kids' toys underneath the trunk of the other tree. So it's pretty scary. A lot of times I don't really get to perform tree risk assessment. I get to kind of see the forensics. It's like the crime scene investigation. I get to see what happened after that fact. So when we're determining the likelihood of a failed tree or a branch striking a person, one thing to also consider is just the frequency and intensity of the use of the site. So if sometimes these backyards are actually pretty low risk areas, because it might be a 90-year-old person who doesn't ever go in their backyard. They might have a sketchy tree, but they don't really care because they're not worried about getting crushed. But obviously someone who has to run a daycare with 10 kids in the backyard, that's going to be a big and then just my own little kind of extra definition for becoming a practical arborist or being a practical arborist. There's going to be like later talk in this discussion about liability and like doing the right thing by the client. And that's kind of my whole thing with doing tree work is like, I try to be a practical arborist, and I rely on a lot of other smarter people to like do the research and studies so that I can pull those and copy and paste them into an email and look smart. So for myself, I consider myself a very practical arborist where I have that. Sorry, Caleb, do you hear any sound? I'm just kind of hearing a little feedback. Okay. Well, I think we're okay, as long as the sound's okay. Okay, cool. I didn't know if that was just on my end, but regardless, so what I'm kind of talking about being a practical arborist is doing things like getting an introductory education, whether you go to college or tech school. Sometimes you don't even have to go to school, just get out in the field and practice, And obviously continued education like these webinars are super valuable, doing workshops, reading books. I just read Jeff Jepson's Groundy, which is like, I'm pretty far removed from being a groundy, but like it's really valuable to even read kind of remedial, what you would think is remedial things, just to refresh yourself and keep yourself a little more grounded, literally, to the what we're doing every day. And then definitely for me, because I'm more of a consulting role, I'm not in the field team, I have to think about, remembering what it was like to be part of that. So I still think no matter where you are in this industry, you should develop those practical skills of climbing, felling, equipment maintenance, and then even just dealing with people. And then what's helped me a lot is just kind of my outside skills. So being creative or having technical knowledge, or just even knowing a guy that can fix a fence is really helpful in this industry. So just being a really practical, rounded out person just helps you be better at this type of job. I think it's really important to provide solutions so that we're not just taking orders for a client. We're providing them with a solution like, okay, here's your problem, here's how I can fix it, or here's how we can get close to fixing it with this solution. And then just put in the work. Like, I worked really hard to get certified, and I will still, do meetings with clients and then finish up the day dragging brush with the crew. I think that's really fun. Definitely, just be true and honest to your clients or to your crew. And then just if you have an opportunity to get involved in doing stuff like teaching a webinar or being part of your local chapter of ISA, just give it a shot. So that's my own little personal nugget. I just wanted to add it to the definitions, because the whole webinar is just from the approach of tree risk assessment as just me being a basically normal arborist talking with clients. It doesn't have to be this big elevated important thing like, oh, I'm a tree risk assessment guy. So yeah, moving on to TRAQ assessments, unfortunately, this is the section where we're going to have a wall of text because there's just so much information in the assessment portion of this. But I'll try to keep it brief and kind of go off the most highlighted things. This is just kind of there. This again is mostly kind of dissected from the ISA Tree Risk Assessment refresher course. So if you want to get a little more direct, even if you haven't taken the TRAQ, you can take this refresher course online. There's CEUs involved, but it doesn't add to your like accreditation or anything. So assessment, the goal of tree risk assessment and management is to eliminate or reduce potentially dangerous situations. This is accomplished by inspecting trees, identify what can be done to reduce risk, and taking action to do so. And I like the top section here, just talking about competent assessment, because that goes back to being a practical arborist. I think you need to be kind of a rounded out arborist to do an effective tree risk assessment, because it does require a strong foundation in tree biology and a fundamental comprehension of the structure, function, relations of trees. So without the knowledge, a lot of things that you might think you see, you might miss. You can go totally unrecognized if you don't know what a certain mushroom is. Or even if you don't know the mushroom, that's fine. It's just good to know more about tree biology and how trees work. Just because once you understand what you're dealing with, you can understand how it might fall apart. So I added this part here too, like trust your experience, cutting, felling, rigging, dragging, and loading wood with your own weight. So like if you're not used to going out and working with a crew, it's really valuable to give it a shot. Set a date aside to do that if you're in more of a consulting role, or just do like, a lot of us do our own work at home or whatever, or for family. But you think about like how do branches tend to snap cut in the winter versus summer, or, obviously we have considerations for storm and extra load on trees. So you just get a feel for trees when you work with them that I think is really hard to, I can tell you 5 years ago, before I was really working as a climber, I probably wouldn't be able to do good tree risk assessment without having spent a couple of years in the field. There are different levels to assessment. So kind of the first most minimum bare standard for a tree risk assessment is you observe the conditions and characteristics from just one side of the tree, either as a drive-by or walking by the tree. And this would be something you maybe do if you work for a municipality or large estates, but if you have a limited visual inspection. I know it's part of TRAQ, so it's fine. And that might be somebody who's watching, that might be their job. But obviously, I just get that chip on my shoulder, like, oh God, like when working for arborists, going like, did they just drive by and look at one branch and note that on the proposal, and then we sold the job? Like, did they miss half this tree? There's like double the amount of dead wood in here that I have to cut now. So it's just my own chip on my shoulder of like, well, do the full job, do the full inspection, because that's really what we need when we go out to do the work. So providing a full visual inspection, probing the tree, and or additional conversation with the owner/tree manager about the site is just a typical average meeting for me. Like I walk around properties and talk with clients, and I'll take like a utility flag and like poke in a crevice or crack to see how deep it goes. Like you don't need a very specific tools to do tree risk assessment. Your eyes and your hands and little probes are going to pretty much do everything you need. There's obviously more in-depth assessment techniques, including decay testing, root collar excavation, and aerial inspection of the ground. And I've actually sold a few of these where you actually go up and either collect samples because we're concerned about a disease, or we're just basically going up to inspect a cavity in a tree. So those should be, you should be paid for those extra assessments as well. I didn't really talk about getting paid to do this, but if you're just meeting with a client in hopes of getting some work, that's one thing. I won't charge for that if there's the potential to sell some work. But if I'm doing a full tree inspection, then I might be inclined to say, well, you got 10 trees on the property, I'm going to charge you an hour and a half to 2 hours to do this process. So you just got to decide what's fair for you and your time. You're a valuable asset to have an arborist come to a property. And then especially if a crew's coming to your property, you should definitely be getting paid for that. And then we'll talk a little bit about assessment forms. The last tree risk assessment form I filled out was in the 4 years ago when I did the TRAQ course. But they are very important for learning the system of tree risk assessment, which we'll get into in a little bit. The systematic procedure should be followed because it is helpful so you don't miss things. The forms that ISA provides has, sections for observations, measurements, recommendations, and it's like one document that you could hand to a client and say, here's your tree risk assessment report. And there are things like ranking trees by severity of defect or target rating. That might be more applicable to someone who works for a city, or if you're dealing with somebody with a big estate with, you need to prioritize what trees are at higher risk. Clients will do that for me too, but if I'm working with 4 trees, I can tell you like, well, the silver maple's crappier than the ash tree. We'll deal with the ash tree later. Like sometimes you can do stuff like that, but I don't really use numbers or ranking for risk. I just spell it out in kind of plain terms. The next section, the next slide has the discussion of whole tree assessment. And this is basically what I do as an arborist every day. And then on the right-hand side of this slide is that an example of the form that's available for basic tree risk assessment. Like I said, I don't use that form on the daily. I have a notebook that I just make my own notes on, and I also have a computer system where I document these things. So when performing an inspection, it's important to stick to a system and a consistent process to ensure that you learn everything that you need to make your determinations or how to pass that on to a client or to a property manager or something like that. So when I'm basically just selling work as a salesperson, I'm still doing TRAQ. I'm still doing tree risk assessment. And because I learned how to use those forms in the past, I kind of have a basic pattern of stand back, look at the canopy, look at the branches, look at the trunk, look at the base of the tree, talk to the homeowner about the history of the tree, look for pruning cuts. Like I really love to see other people's work because sometimes it's interesting to, even today, I just looked at a nice red oak with spike marks all the way up the trunk. It was a live tree. It had just been spiked last year. It was really disappointing to see that. So you kind of think those old school guys are gone, but there's a lot of them still around. So you just got to be, a little critical of everyone's work, because I think everyone should be accountable for the things that are good and the things that could be bad or improved. But this is kind of my system of what I'm looking at for a whole tree assessment. So I'm looking for a dieback in the crown, because that's going to tell me even about what may be going on in the root system. Looking for the lean. And I really love seeing those huge trees with those really elongated branches, especially if they have weak attachments. Like having done enough storm damage cleanup, we all know that at least in the Midwest, we're dealing with willows, silver maples, lindens, ash trees. Those are kind of the most planted trees around here anyway, but they're also the ones that tend to be the most involved in storm damage. It is nice to see and look for reaction wood. So cavities don't typically scare me in a tree. I'm pretty undeterred, but like if someone wants to save a tree and it's got a big cavity, the first thing I'm looking at is not like how big the cavity is, but what the response wood is of that tree, and to know, is that tree reacting to store up strength after losing, part of that live wood on the outside by basically growing, or, we all kind of know that turning ram's horn look on cavities. So if you don't see any sort of response wood, then okay, this tree is not doing anything to help itself recover or maintain strength. So there's more considerations for what the risk of that tree is. And then stem taper and overall tree structure. I really love structure pruning. Mostly on younger trees. It's kind of a pain on big old trees when we're trying to structure prune, but it's really important for long-term tree health and structure. Guys here in Minnesota like Nick Grebe really have cool approaches to structure pruning. There's some really cool materials. Ed Gilman has good documents about structure pruning. So structure pruning on like small to medium trees is like my favorite thing to sell because it's less debris, it's easier work for the crew, and it's actually a long-term beneficial pruning strategy. And then obviously, again, consider tree species and consult your own experience or another arborist experience for pruning and removal with tree species. Are there any questions, Kale, about anything that I've kind of talked about for this tree inspection so far?
I have one question so far. Hold on one second here. I have to turn this down because I can hear myself, and I can't speak if I can hear myself.
Oh, yeah.
What was this? Oh, it's talking about targets. Would you consider another tree as a target?
Yeah, absolutely. Like when you have a valuable tree, it's like I have one client that I have to personally shape his globe flowering almond tree because no one can do it better than me apparently. So that tree does have some pretty significant sized trees all around it, and if that were to be hit, that would be a significant loss to that property, even though it's only a 4 foot tall tree. Or if it's still another big tree, if you have that, like an elongated silver maple stem that could fall and damage an adjacent tree, definitely, consider what you need to do to preserve the one tree to protect the other tree. So yes, I would say definitely.
All right. I think that's it for now. I'm sure they'll keep coming in as you keep going.
Yeah.
And I'll let you know if any pop up because usually it takes a second.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah, there's just kind of a few more slides of tree assessment, and then we'll kind of break it down into how a little bit more clear about some actual examples of real life things. But basically all the pictures in this webinar are my own. So I have a good backlog of 5 years of pictures and counting of cool things we've done for trees. So the next slide here after whole tree assessment is talking about individual parts of the tree. And I think we've kind of already covered some of these. I just really wanted to kind of go in again, like looking for the root flare, the trunk flare, making sure that that is not part of the problem of this tree. Looking for any trunk wounds or cracks or decay, sloughing bark, things like that. Obviously, co-dominant stems and branching, like we really need to watch out for those co-doms. They're either going to lead to decay or pretty serious storm damage. The tree in the picture is really neat, and I didn't add all the other pictures to it, but that tree has a pretty clear seam near, basically in the middle, following on the lead to the right-hand side of that. But that whole seam was open about 3 inches last year. The right-hand side had basically failed, and so this was a super important silver maple and was the only tree on the property. So I gave the proposal for removal alongside the proposal to hold the tree together. And this is a picture basically 1 year later. So we have 2 steel bolts going through the trunk to help pull, like we used a come along to pull the top back together. We then bolted it together, and then we cabled it, I think at least 2 cables up in that canopy. So the target of that was the house. It was basically going right at the house and the kids' play place and a patio. It was basically the most valuable tree to this homeowner, and they're still living there. I visited again just to kind of check on it because I like to look at trees that I've done major surgery on and just basically to a follow-up. But it was really neat. I wish I'd posted the pictures, but the response wood, even where we drilled and have the nuts holding the bolts together, it's already starting to grow over those nuts really quickly. So the reaction of that silver maple is super impressive. But the caveat is we know that that seam will never really heal over. This basically 2 trees kind of held together. It's a very thin section of living wood outside of that basically compromised wood. And part of the problem of this was that in the highlighted bold text here, for strong structure, branches should be smaller than the trunk diameter and spaced vertically along the trunk. Like, obviously the branch was smaller than the trunk diameter, but the way it was attached and all the other branches were of similar size, so it had a major codominant issue and just a bad seam from the start. So tree, that's like, you know, a tree as a homeowner, you're always kind of almost going against your own instinct sometimes. Like if I were a homeowner, I would have chopped that tree up and started over. So, but that was not an option for that homeowner in their head. On the next slide here, we're talking about decay with tree risk assessment, and that's a big portion of this. You know, decay is sometimes really hard to detect, and like I've been totally fooled by it. I've looked at trees that I thought were totally solid, and then in the picture on the left-hand side, it's like totally composted on the inside of that tree. And this is the same tree that was in the backyard that I showed earlier with a daycare. And so, I mean, we literally took a shovel and we dug out that compost because we didn't want to cut through that with the chainsaw. So when we took this out by crane, and yeah, that was a sketchy tree. So the day before it fell, though, I would have told you it's pretty solid, because I bet even if I took a mallet to try to hear hollowness, it probably would have sounded different than solid wood, but it wouldn't have been too muffled because that was pretty compacted compost inside there. And then, of course, we're always looking for mushrooms and things like that growing along. I think what's really interesting about trees is they really only need a really thin layer of active xylem and phloem on the outside to stay green, but the actual wood inside is, you know, a good portion of what makes the structure. I mean, I do again think that hollow trees are still pretty strong, except for when you throw wind factors and storms and snow load and things that can throw that out the window. But yeah, you could have a totally leafed out green tree like this tree was, and it just fall apart in a not even that severe of a storm. On the next slide here, we're just talking about there are different types of decay. And I'm not going to go super in depth. This isn't, you know, like mushroom and fungi talk, but it's definitely an interest I personally have. Even before I was really tree climbing a lot, I was always taking pictures of mushrooms and talking about mushrooms and looking at and growing mushrooms. But there are three kind of basic like types of decay that we know about or talk about when we're looking at tree decay. There's white rot decay, white rot fungi, which it basically kills off or eats the lignin between the cell walls. So if you think of like brick and mortar, you have the bricks and the mortar. The white rot's going to eat the mortar that's holding the bricks together. So lignin's that material that gives the wood its compressive strength. It allows it to move and blow in the wind. So it can basically reduce that and make it more easy to break. Basically, the reason why it's called white rot is because it takes away that brown coloring colored after that lignin is gone. So you have white rot. I've always gotten mentally kind of messed up by that because white rot takes away the brown. I don't know. So moving on then to brown rot, which is more common in conifers, but that decay is primarily decaying the cellulose, so the wood left behind looks a lot darker. It's still pretty like punky and soft and falling apart. They always talk about how redwoods are really rot resistant, but when I traveled out to California and checked out some redwoods, you could find some examples of old stumps where they're really punky. You could just kind of put your hand into them like foam, and that was definitely brown rot left over in those redwood stumps. And then sapwood rot is a little bit harder to pin. It's something we see a little bit more on actually like logs and dead trees, but it's kind of characteristic of both brown and white. Yeah, so sapwood rot's just another one. I think I generally tend to just use the terms white rot or brown rot, but with clients, I don't really even break it down. I just said you have decay. I don't really care to qualify what type of decay is because it doesn't really matter to the homeowner, and it doesn't really change the mitigation or control strategies that I have. It's basically, if you got rot or decay, it's just there. You know, we could spend a while talking about it, but let's just be more practical and just say it's decay. but there are different types. It's just, if you're really interested in how that affects the dynamics of the wood, there's probably tons of research about these different decay fungi. What I think is more important is where the decay is located. So on the next slide, I have some examples of, where decay happens. And so again, I could just keep using these same pictures of that tree that fell down at a daycare, but obviously it was really rotten at the base, and it was rotten all the way up to the very tip of the tree. Practically it just narrowed down as it went up the trunk. But literally we're just talking about locations, right? So like we're qualifying it as, okay, if there's decay in the branch, it's got branch rot. There's trunk rot if it's in the trunk, in the upper portion of the trunk. Basal rot if it's in the lower part, yada, yada. I'm more worried on the last bullet points where it has heart rot. Obviously that's in the center. So sometimes it will qualify that, like, yeah, you got heart rot, so you're losing that structural stability in the interior of the tree. Then there's sapwood rot, which I see a lot of, especially in maples. The picture on the bottom right is basically just the tree. It actually looks bigger than it is. I cut it down with a 201. But you can see these little fungi. It's kind of hard to see. I didn't zoom in on good enough, but like that was the only good picture I had of sapwood rot, of all these tiny, teeny little mushrooms on the outer bark. That's a way basically it's eating the wood, but you can see on the interior there's a little bit of staining on the heartwood, but it's actually a very structurally great tree. It just was totally, fried on top. It was a dead tree. But that again is a good example of just sapwood rot. And then I'm not going super into it on the next page, but there are tons of other. I think more people, when they think of tree risk assessment, they're thinking of the folks using the high-tech devices like tomography and using X-ray and radar and things like that. And Davy's kind of a cool company because we actually have like access to those tools, but they're kind of employed only on very specific, requests. And it's not something I would typically, go out of my way to have someone come and do that. If you're working for a smaller company, you can always hire a consultant that specifically does tree risk assessment and has these things like tomography and X-ray. The tomography, I didn't get any good pictures of it, but it's basically like, where they tap around the base of the tree and they use sound waves to hear or visualize the decay in the trunk. It's just really not a tool I would commonly use. Resistograph, I might, because I know people locally that do use resistographs, and they're basically drilling into the tree. And that graph will tell you, kind of like a Richter scale, how soft or firm the wood is as you drill into it. I have used an incremental borer in the past where you just kind of, tap it and you pull out you make a pretty large hole in the tree, but you can actually get a core sample and see, for however long your increment borer is, what the wood layers actually look like. And then I don't really do drilling just to drill trees, and find soft spots, but you can do that to kind of test the resistance in the wood, and it just gives you more information. If you're more used to drilling wood, how it feels when it's going through solid wood, obviously, versus decayed wood. The most common place you're going to be drilling into a tree is at the base when you're doing trunk injection. So a lot of plant healthcare technicians have kind of done resistance testing, or you drilled and you find a soft spot and you're like, oh, nope, I'm not going to inject it there. So you can learn a lot about a tree by drilling it. I just don't really feel like drilling trees for no reason beyond, knowing what it feels like, I guess. And the picture is just basically an example of me using a silky saw. We know the length of that. So I poke that into a hole just to see, hey, does this go all the way, or like I'm tied into this, so should I be or not? So that's basically using tree risk assessment for my own safety. If it's something that the arborist did not even know was up there, or I didn't know it was up there till I was already ascending on it. There's just, again, I'm definitely more of a proponent for using hand tools like a mallet. I always have a D tape with me to kind of get the idea of the size of the trunk. Little probes and things like that you have in your car are really handy. Are there any questions about those tools or any other tree risk assessment type of stuff?
I do have a couple questions here.
Yeah.
And I'm going to read them off because my little system where it pops up on the screen is not working with me right now.
Okay.
Our first question is Mason Hanrahan. You mentioned that a lot of your work is forensic and involves figuring out what happened after a failure. The TRAQ manual covers risk assessment prior to a failure but doesn't discuss conducting risk assessment after a failure. Do you have any books or other resources that help you specifically with risk assessment afterwards?
I don't think there's a ton of publications for that. A lot of it I'm just doing on the fly. Like, last year in August, I was literally the only guy in my office running around taking appointments on a weekend after a storm blew through. And I was just basically doing mental, first tree risk assessment to assess what's happening on the site. Like, are there power lines down? Is it safe for my crew to work here now? Or do I need to wait for the utility company to come through? A lot of it's just done on the fly, but it's stuff when you do more storm damage cleanup and you see how trees break and fall apart, I think that's super valuable because I'm taking what I see in that scenario and applying it to a tree in another site before it breaks. So it's just basically giving me a little bit more informed response to how scared I am of that branch likelihood of failing. So I don't have a lot of publications for that. There's probably a billion Instagram posts of guys working on storm damage that you can just look at, but it's a really hard one to take that experience unless you actually go out and do it.
Another one here, Arnus, asking about the tree that you pretty much stitched together. He says, drilling, you mean the invasive method for bracing, isn't that bad? How did you come around to the decision that drilling and putting through bracing was the best way to take care of that problem?
Yeah, that's a good question because, typically I don't like to Frankenstein trees together and put bolts in them. And, I do that as kind of a per tree and per client basis. It's not my go-to answer every time. Like, a lot of times when a tree is failing, my gut feeling is let's just get that completely out of the risk. I don't like the risk of that at all. Try to hold those trees together than it does just to get them out of the backyard. But I'm not personally inclined to just say, okay, let's cut down every tree because of risk, or defining something as bad to a tree. Like, I definitely agree, old practices like filling trees with cement is bad. Cavity filling was taught by Davey, so I'm basically working with a company that's had to evolve with the times. Metal bracing and tapping trees isn't always bad. There's a lot of gray area with tree care. And it depends. You can have your own personal rules and saying, I'm never going to do that. I don't really have the luxury of doing that because you work with so many different people, and you have so many different cases with trees that I try to base my personal feelings and what the evidence will show on the response of the tree or what I expect it to. So with a tree like that, it was not completely failing where the tree had split all the way down to the bottom, and it wasn't laying on the house. It just was starting to open further. So we basically got there within 24 hours of me seeing that tree. I said, hey, if you want to save the tree, we got to come ASAP. And we held that tree together. We cabled it properly. Everything is according to, ANSI standards. So we're not just kind of doing it for shits and giggles, forget my language, but I don't necessarily like to do that. It wasn't my preferred option, but it worked. And again, I'm basing it on the response of the tree, so it responded positively. The new wood is growing over the nut ends, and again, I know that where I bolted it, it's not going to fix the fibers and pull the wood back together, but it is more of a temporary thing where I know probably someday this will be a tree removal, but in the short term, I can make that tree safer and at least minimize some risk. So there's enough gray area. I don't necessarily call certain things bad unless you're talking about, I think that was a better option than lopping off half the tree and trying to hope for the best for the rest of it. So I just kind of picked the lesser of two evils.
Gotcha. The other one here, I don't know if you're going to get into talking about it later on, but there are some questions about how you decide how much decay in a tree is acceptable, whether you're talking about whether you're doing it as a percentage of the mass of the tree, or
Well, yeah.
the amount of good wood, like the depth of the good wood. So if you want to speak about that now, or just say you're going to get into that later, it's up to you.
Yeah, I don't think I'll get super in depth in it later. Basically, just my note on that is like I don't really use like a formula or percentage. You know, sometimes it is kind of a gut check, and it also is again based on tree species. So if I see some decay in a a bur oak or something, I'm going to be a little less worried about that decay or cavity in that tree than I would maybe a silver maple or something of a softer wood. So it just depends on the tree. We'll get into what type of risk or decay is acceptable later too, because there are, it depends on the target, depends on the person who owns the tree. You know, one little pocket that I could stick my silky in may not be acceptable for a homeowner, and that might be enough for them to say, let's cut the tree down. So we'll get more into that as we go.
Okay. What? One more thing. I don't know if you said this at the beginning or not. Can you get your tree assessment qualification without having your arborist certification?
Yeah, as far as I'm aware, that's the case, because I remember when I first was going to take TRAQ was actually like 1 or 2 days before I was getting my ISA certification, and it was also like a week before I graduated from college. So I just didn't quite meet the minimum that they need for doing TRAQ. But as far as I'm aware and how I interpreted the ISA website is you do not need to have your ISA certification first. This is like almost a completely separate qualification with ISA.
Gotcha. Okay, I think we're ready to keep going.
Okay. So the next section, I'm hopefully not going on too long or it's not too boring, but we'll kind of speed through how I use TRAQ daily, talk a little bit about liability for you as the arborist, and then just give you some, if you want to see more real life examples, I have examples of those near the end of the slides as well. So for me, I am in sales and service. I want to make sure that I'm selling good tree work, and I think having my TRAQ qualification or credential is super additive to like my skill set. So a lot of times a client's just going to call me, they want a free tree assessment, or I just want a guy to look at my trees. Like that's kind of like, well, what do you mean? Do you need me to do a full TRAQ assessment here, or am I just going to price raising up some maple branches, you know? So a lot of times they're just needing a quote. They're not really needing this full thing, but I do offer often to say, hey, I've got an hour here with you. Let me look at your whole property and see if I can spot anything we need to watch out for. Sometimes it's kind of towing the line of like feeling like the used car salesman. I don't want to be like, oh, we better cut that tree and that tree and that tree while we're here so you get a bundle or something. Like that's not what I'm doing. I'm basically just going, hey, you know, I know we are focusing on this one tree here in the front yard, but what's going on with that tree in the back there? Like, let's talk about that before I go. So it's a pretty informal process talking about tree risk assessment client meeting. And then, you know, the things that I do have in my tool chest when I'm coming out for every appointment is obviously I keep a sounding mallet, diameter tape, hand trowel. I really love to pull up Google Maps, especially if I see like a river birch that's really looking like chlorotic and pretty crappy. And a lot of times clients will be like, oh, I just started doing that. And then you can go on Google Maps, or you can go like on a county website and see maps over the past decade and be like, no, it looked like that since 2010, you know, like, so there's some pretty cool tools online. And then The other one, a good case of that is that someone had built a patio and retaining wall around a tree and were trying to tell me that the ash injections we did on it the year before were starting to kill the tree. And it's like, well, let's do some tree risk assessment. Sort of, it's kind of adjacent, but I went back online, saw the year they did the construction, and it's almost 6 years later and the tree looks like crap. It's like, yeah, you messed up your tree. So it's a good tool to have because it just makes you think a little bit further about, since I have the system of TRAQ, I'm thinking more in depth about each tree that I'm observing. And then I just also like noting again, it's like tree health and structure are not the same. A tree can stay alive, but it can be totally structurally crappy. So, we need to keep in mind that green trees really fail. And I've been really humbled by me thinking a tree is totally fine and then having it fall apart on me later. Continuing with that vein on the next slide, splitting up sales and services, so my job is to provide, more informed solutions to the clients. I go beyond that order taking portion where they're just saying, cut that one tree. I'm giving them more information. I create a proposal that's clear and provides you with, hey, why are we going to prune this tree? What's the goal? Well, to clear away from the house or to lighten tip weight to minimize risk of damage. Those are kind of typical verbiage on my work orders. It's also nice for creating a long-term partnership or plan with a client rather than just saying, hey, I'm going to prune that one tree and I'm out of here. Like, it's kind of cool because you can create like a tree risk assessment for a client, offer them the mitigation to help fix the tree or, mitigate some of the risk. And then you go, well, maybe I should check on this tree every year. Does it need more pruning? Will it need fertilizer? So there is opportunity to add on sales. So you don't need to be just the tree cutter guy. You can expand your tool chest and do plant health care on the same trees that you prune. So it's kind of cool to be like, it just expands your profitability as well and your ability to sell more work. And then, like I mentioned before, it just answers some questions after a tree has fallen when you're more like, here's why it fell, or you can give your best guesstimation. And then the service side of it, the service is provided by your crew or yourself if you're the salesperson and doing the work. But the crew needs a clear plan and they need you to account before they get there what the hazards and risks and type of equipment they need in order to be successful on the job site. So you're answering before they get there, what are the what if questions that the crew might have? Well, what if it happened? What if we can't rig it? What if we can't get the crane in? What if we can't? What if we just have to fell it into somebody's house, not the house, but like their garden or something? Like, there's a lot of what if questions that you have to answer before you even sell the job. And I know it's a lot of work to think further when you're busy, and especially when we get the heat of the summer, we're just going to have a hard time keeping up. But still slow yourself down and do that basic tree risk assessment on a tree that you or your crew has to climb. And again, you want your guys to be successful and provide them an overall better day. Gives you better results for the crew and for your clients. So that's how I use TRAQ, just kind of in a basic everyday way. The next slide, this is one I wanted to touch on in this section just because I deal with so many neglected trees. Like, this is a great picture of a hackberry that had a failure, and you can see the hole right through the trunk. And that was a really fun tree to look at, but they didn't end up going with me to do the work. They hopefully had it cut down. I have no idea, but there was actually some decent response wood in that tree, but it was just totally hollow and falling apart. But the typical things we see in a neglected tree, they offer a lot more things to consider with tree risk assessment and what could happen if they don't do anything versus, what are the risks my guys have to take when they climb that tree. So we're obviously in neglected trees looking for dead and broken branches, things like fungi and cavities, bark falling off. And you have those internal decay indicators, so you get really weird shaped limbs or bases of trees, weird reaction wood. Obviously, cracks and splits, codoms are your most common things you'll see in a neglected tree. Poor branch taper, elongated stems. then you get those site changes. So people have a really unending creativity and propensity to mess trees up. And so then our job is to try to fix them. And sometimes we can't. So there's a lot of things to consider with neglected trees, but they require a serious inspection. Like sometimes you get a weird chip on your shoulder, like, oh, this guy just let his tree go to crap and now he just needs me to try to fix it. Like, so you're kind of more likely to, I wouldn't say blow them off, but not your full attention. So, but in the case that you sell these jobs, you need to give them a really serious inspection, because I want to make sure my crew is safe. So even if you're not really happy with the situation, it's still good to do a good tree risk assessment. Then the next section is going to be another really wordy one, and then we can do more fun stuff. So TRAQ and liability. Oh, maybe I skipped a slide, actually. Mitigating risk. Let's stay on that real quick. Obviously, we kind of talked about solutions for mitigating risk, and how do we deal with cavities? Do we fill them? I would say no. But there's different feelings for that, just as there's different feelings for spiking trees. So cabling and bracing, some people obviously don't like dealing with that. Sometimes I will, if it's worth the time and effort. But I typically prefer to do the following things, like reduction and targeted pruning to make the tree safer as much as we can. Sometimes we have to cut off a big limb. I know when we talk about coat it, we know that's not a good thing. A lot of times when I remove a 20-inch silver maple limb, I know I'm coming back. It's just a slow removal. Like, I'm coming back in a couple of years to cut the rest of the tree down. We hate doing that, but sometimes that's the answer that's acceptable for that homeowner, and if it still meets ANSI standards, I'll do it if there's no other option. Basically, I'd rather cut a big branch and protect a structure than to take a whole tree down that I know is healthy and that might be able to react well. I know that's probably the most controversial thing I'll say, but limb removal is not my favorite. That's not my go-to, but it's something that you have to do sometimes. I prefer to do support systems, again, cabling or dynamic cabling I like even better. Proper pruning. I'd much rather sell annual plant health care than chop trees down. So if I can save a tree with growth regulator and fertilizer, things like that. I love root collar excavation, but sometimes all we can do is just chop the tree down. With managing risk, it's also dealing with the people involved. So you have to set the expectation for the homeowner that there are going to be risks associated with saving a tree. Sometimes we can block off the area to the tree. I don't know if that's really a legitimate, likely thing in a residential backyard or something, but maybe on a larger estate, you can fence in an area and keep the tree out of harm's way or people out of its way. Sometimes there's just things like this where in the picture, there's just a bench. You can move the bench, so you've taken away a target, so that's a legitimate way to manage risk. And then we'll move on to liability. This one was kind of my hang up with tree risk assessment, is like, okay, now I'm getting more educated about tree risk assessment. Am I going to get called into court to talk about trees that fell apart? Like, what's my liability if I say this tree's safe and it's totally not? So that's where, I do deviate. Like, if I'm just looking at a tree for a client and they want a quick opinion, I'm not saying, hey, here's a legal document saying this is your tree risk assessment. Like, if you're getting that request, you either, if you're not comfortable with it, refer it to someone who does do that type of work, like a consultant. I think an everyday arborist, like most of us who are watching, is not going to want to take on liability of a tree that could potentially fail. But that's the scary part, right? I don't want to be, held responsible for a tree that falls apart. But I do take it that if I do good tree risk assessment and I'm honest and I provide solutions and I pass that to the homeowner, and then pass that liability to the person who manages the trees, because ultimately they make the decision on what to do with the tree. I can't force a client to prune and cable and do fertilizer, they might just walk away from that meeting with you and say, I'm not going to pay that. Good luck. So, but there are things to consider. Obviously negligence is the failure to exercise due care. So that does occur when like us as an arborist, we have an obligation or responsibility with the tree. Say we were asked to cable and help the tree with the caveat that cable support system could still fail, but at least if you basically do something with that tree that directly caused that tree to cause damage or injury, then you could potentially be called into liability. Obviously, worst case scenario, a casualty, someone dying. It's going to get really serious. So I honestly don't have a lot of experience in that realm with the law and trees. So I'm really not the best to speak on it. That's why I think the TRAQ course is so good, because you spend a lot of time on this subject. There's a ton of things in there. Obviously, if you ever work with an insurance company, when a tree falls, it's usually act of nature, which is even funny because, you can tell a client, yeah, you have to do this to protect your tree. And then if they don't do it, when the tree blows over, it's an act of nature. It's still, an act of God or whatever. So I'm going to move a little bit past that, and there might be a lot of questions about it. The best thing I could say is, if you're worried about liability with a tree, ask someone more experienced with you in the field, or hire a firm that does tree risk assessment, as a per job basis. They'll go provide that report, or call a lawyer. That's all I have. But on the second thing about liability with the decision making, that is really the important piece, because to remember that you're not the homeowner. You don't make the final decision. You have to just do the best you can to explain the situation, provide a solution for that. Be honest to your best of your abilities and knowledge. Explain what the risks are, and give that client the informed decision making ability. So again, that thing is on their list. Some clients, it's not acceptable at all to have one branch that broke a year ago, and that they're still scared of that tree, so the tree has to come down. Another person might not care if the whole crown is decaying. It's still an important tree to them. Or I have a client we just worked with that doesn't believe in treating for emerald ash borer. So it's like, well, then let me tell you, I'll prune your tree, but the tree is going to be dying in the next few years. So you just be honest with a person. Don't be afraid to kind of have the weird, uncomfortable talks with a client just to make them happy. It's not your job to always make them happy. It's just to be a professional. And sometimes that creates a little friction with clients. And I've definitely, had to be kind of humbled about the fact that in this bolded part here, you got to accept that your advice is not always going to be taken seriously, or the client might straight up think you don't know what you're talking about. Like, I've done my job if I've provided all that information about tree risk assessment to the homeowner, and if they think I'm dumb or don't know what I'm talking about, I can't change their mind. It really sucks sometimes when you feel like they just kind of wasted your time, and a lot of people will do that. Maybe not on purpose, but you have to accept that, hey, at least the liability's off you, right? You gave them all the information, they kick you out of the property, and you just move on to the next one. So that one's a really hard one for me, because when I have a tree that for some reason I'm attached to and want to save, maybe I drive by it every day and I get a call about it and they decide they want to cut it down. I go, no, I don't want you to cut it down. Sometimes you will oppose a property owner, but as long as you're doing what is, according to ANSI standards, towards OSHA standards, whatever, if you're within current acceptable practices and making these recommendations, they're good. It's not your decision to actually implement them. You're not guaranteed to get hired by the person who has you look at their tree. Kale, are there any questions about liability or any of that stuff? All right. Then we'll move on to case studies. And Kale, you did sound like a chipmunk. I don't know if that was on purpose or not. Okay. Okay. All right. All right. Okay. Well, let's move on to case studies. I have some pretty fun ones here, and this will kind of wrap up the presentation for tonight. So this one's really fun. The first case here is a North Minneapolis silver maple. And if anyone's familiar with the North Minneapolis area, it's not the highest income area. You got big old trees around, a bunch of old houses. There's just a lot of risk for trees. There's power lines everywhere. There's tight access. It's a really crappy place to do tree work sometimes. And this is a tree I got called to after a significant lead in this tree fell apart. I mean, a whole third of the canopy fell magically between two garages. It did take out a power line, but it didn't really significantly do any damage besides an old beat up fence anyway. And you can see it, what we're zoomed in on now is really neat. Like this tree just had totally turned in. If anyone knows that is familiar with that feeling of coconut core, like those recycled core pots, the wood in here, it wasn't even wood anymore. It was just like this really chunky composite soft stuff. And I provided a quote to get that storm damage cleaned up with our crane, and I was about to go on with my day, and then I just, in the back of my head, I had this nagging feeling like if I didn't advise her to cut the rest of the tree down, that maybe I wasn't doing due diligence with like giving her a warning, like, hey, just so you know, the rest of this tree is likely to fall apart. And so I went back and I provided an extra quote for removing the entire tree, and explained to her exactly that, hey, you got two leads. The one magically didn't hit your house, but the other two will hit your house and your neighbor's house. So pretty serious risk. I mean, that was a tree I would never, ever, I wouldn't spend a minute under that tree that I didn't have to. So on the second page of this first case here, we get to see the result of inaction, basically. So about 3 months later, we had some pretty serious storms, and those two leads just fell over. It was not a surprise, big shock. Of course, it happened on a Friday night, so Saturday morning I had to go in and look at this and get our crane out again. Two leads failed, and the quote was just no longer good because it knocked over another tree. So we thought it was going to be still a pretty high priced project. This ended up tripling the price because it was crane crews working overtime. I mean, this is like a lot of wood and a lot of damage. So the house was pretty significantly impacted. Not super bad, as the neighbors was even worse. So all in all, kind of a best case scenario for a giant tree falling apart in your backyard. But my TRAQ background really helped me think through. I mean, it was obvious to anyone that tree was going to fall apart, even if you're a first year groundy. You would look at that tree and go, oh, holy crap, that tree's going to die, or not die, but it's going to potentially kill somebody. But because I had TRAQ training, I just knew enough to think through the liability and what my due diligence is as a professional arborist. So I applied that in this case. My advice was not taken, but hey, I sold the second job where I cleaned this mess up. So that was fun. The next one is we're Davie office space in Plymouth, Minnesota. And in Plymouth is Schmidt Lake. It's a pretty large lake in the area. There are a lot of homes around that are currently being infested with emerald ash borer. And this property had quite a few cases. There's probably 11 ash trees in total on the property. They didn't want to cut down all the ash trees, so we kind of created an action plan of, okay, here's the valuable trees, the ones we want to treat, and here's the ones we want to remove. And this is actually missing a picture. So if we could zoom in on kind of the center tree on the right hand side of that climber that's in the tree. we removed a bunch of trees, including the couple that they're working on now. But there was one central tree that I preserved because it was a larger diameter. It was in a pretty safe spot. Obviously, if a storm were to come through, it could potentially damage the home. So I assessed all the risk of that tree, but it had really no signs of emerald ash borer. It was like the last tree I would have said that was going to, fall over in a storm. So that really, yeah. So going to the next page. Oh no, never mind. Click next, and that should pull up the next picture. I think so. The tree I've highlighted in the second picture basically is the one that ended up totally failing. So in the next picture or next slide, you can see the resulting damage of that. So that was one that was really humbling because I was the tree risk assessor, and I was the guy saying, yep, that tree is totally safe, let it be. Yeah, and that from case one, it was the same storm. It just totally blew out this tree. It had the root system, a little bit of punkiness in the wood, so it did have some root rot and basal rot that I just did not see. I looked at these trees in like December with some snow on the ground. I sold tree removals during that time too. I definitely felt like I was doing the best thing as an arborist, but obviously when storms get mixed in there, things just happened that were completely unexpected. So that still was like in that realm of it's an act of God. I still did my due diligence. I inspected the tree. I assessed it to be safe. And really the homeowner is really cool. They didn't blame me. The only thing that sucked is we had just injected that ash tree. So like, obviously I credited their cost of trunk injections for the tree removal, but that was a big ordeal because you can see there's power lines that are on it. There's a steep slope, a newly installed garden around it. It really kind of sucked. So it just sucks to have good clients, and when bad things happen, it just, especially when it happens under your watch. So just a good example of like, hey, yeah, there's a lot of things that those storms can do where you can totally be comfortable with that tree, but it'll throw it completely out the window. The next page here will show you kind of an odd tree that I didn't take a picture of it before it fell, but we had just worked on this property in Golden Valley where we did some other tree removals, but we left these big old dead spars in the backyard. This client was a regular client, or is still a regular client, really good client. About 10, 15 years ago, a previous arborist topped them all because they were dead already. So the guy climbed, had him, his crew basically climbed a dead tree, knocked some tops off to create natural spars, which I'm not against at all. But I think they just left the spars really tall, so more prone to falling or being windblown. And so the funny thing was this tree is laying over a perennial garden that was just planted a year or two before. And the guy actually had my crew take a pole saw and knock all the bark off of that side of the tree because it kept continuously falling down on the perennials. And so we did that before the perennials were going to pop up. Well, then, yeah, a few months later, or maybe only a month later, basically this tree was down on everything, crushed the deck and some stairs, newly installed cedar stairs. The dock just got put in 2 days before. It was a pretty crappy situation. There was literally no access. And again, the homeowner didn't blame me or anything. It was just kind of it looked pretty punky, but because that tree had been standing dead for 10 or 15 years, I was or even beyond that, I really didn't assess that as a high risk tree targets, but it's an older couple. They don't spend a lot of time in that space. So fortunately the risk was low, even though the damage resulting from it was pretty severe. So just a case of extra consideration when you're working with these dead old trees, because I find that these trees that have been standing dead forever, they stand forever until they don't. All of a sudden they're down for a rotten base or windstorm, something like that. So those kind of legacy old spars on a property, maybe because I had a bad feeling about that. I definitely didn't want my crew to climb it to knock bark off, so we used pull tools, so like I kind of had a gut feeling that this was going to be a bad situation, and it turned out being that way. A lot of these cases, again, aren't really like a full-on tree risk assessment. It's just more observations and how I'm applying it to future thoughts on how I do tree risk assessment for real. And then there is just a couple more cases. We have the next one here is case 4, is the Plymouth oak. I can, Kale, but I can hear you, Kale, but it's really hard because it's very like chipmunked. Okay.
All right, so I've got a question here. Going back to the ash in the wintertime,
Yeah.
kind of want to ask about how weather and like frost on the ground and snow on the ground will impact your tree assessments that you do. Did you catch that?
Yeah, like tree risk assessment yeah, can you hear me okay? Yeah, yeah, you're good. Tree risk assessment is really stifled, I think, in the wintertime because you're obviously not seeing leaves on the tree. You're not seeing you kind of miss some of the clues on the vitality of the tree, whether it's leaf color or leaf density or leaf size. So that's one stifled thing. And then, of course, like I can't do a basal inspection when there's snow on the ground. Like working in these, areas of the country where we get snow or around the world, like, sometimes I can get my little car shovel out and kind of dig around the base of the tree in the winter, but sometimes just like we get, minus 20 degrees days here, and I'm not really going to break ice to look at the base of a tree. So I think you do a lot more complete and informed tree risk assessment in the summer, but there's still obviously things you can look for in the winter, like, trunk decay, bark falling off, basically we get pretty good with our eyes at seeing tree buds up in the upper canopy. And if you're missing those leaf buds, even though they're kind of shrunk in the winter, tips, then I can pretty much guess that branch is dead. There is something to be said of going, hey, I can't see enough here in the winter, let me come back. Or let's do a second level assessment or a third level assessment where I have a climber go up there and, after I determine this tree is safe enough to climb, maybe we can get them up doing an aerial inspection, either with a bucket truck or a climber. So it's definitely not that easy. And this is definitely a case where I could not tell enough what was happening in that tree until it fell down. Any other questions? Cool. All right. So we'll just go on to our last case because I just think it's kind of cool. And then I got a few odds and ends and then some wrap up. So case 4 with this Plymouth oak was really interesting because it was a late night call. Homeowner had just moved from Utah, and now they have this tree that's sitting on top of their vehicle and a storage unit that they brought. And so the client, basically was like, well, my car is totaled and there's a family piano inside the storage unit that's worth more than my brand new car. That's totally smashed too. So this one was interesting because they had somebody come out and kind of a tree guy look at the trees at one point. There was a lot of new construction, but a previous person had basically said, hey, there's nothing here that'll hit your house or mess up. There's definitely trees close enough that could, but nothing I'm concerned about. Well, then basically a week after they move in, they have this tree fall down, and it's kind of hard to see in the format of these pictures, but it's along the drive. The tree is like 60 feet long, and that really the only thing that really damaged anything was the very upper canopy. So a pretty serious case where what was cool is the resulting damage. No, I don't think it's cool for the homeowner, but for me is watching, like cleaning it up. We took all the branches, cleaned up the canopy, and then we got to look in the storage unit, and I have pictures of that on the next page. The storage unit was totally gone. I mean, totally smashed, but inside the storage unit, that piano was missed by like a few centimeters. It was super cool. Like, so, somehow that piano survived. The car did not, the storage unit did not, but this is kind of a case of like maybe a less than thorough tree risk assessment. And so it made me realize like how many times I've been to a property and did not give it the full once over. And I definitely wouldn't have considered that tree a high risk because again, it was one with internal, were not seen visually. So it would have required, we usually don't have the time to go to an acreage and mallet every tree on the property, but I just thought this is a nice kind of cap off of like, whoa, that was cool. And maybe there wasn't anything we could do about it, but, and that was probably, again, there's probably 10 other trees closer to the house. I would have said, you should probably be worried about them. But this one I wouldn't have. I probably would have agreed with the previous arborist, like, yeah, there's probably nothing going to happen. So it kind of sucks that, again, we're doing a lot of TRAQ talk that's forensic and after the fact. But hey, at least we have these good examples to help inform us on the next time we actually do tree risk assessment. The next page is I'm just gonna have two last examples of just weird odds and ends that I thought were funny. So like when you do tree risk assessment, a lot of times we're just thinking of like the normal stuff. This ash tree has an entire cat jungle gym built around it. The only call description I had was come and look at my ash and make sure it's healthy because I don't want it to fall over. Well, I found out pretty quickly why, basically he has two cats that has this like wireframe system of running around this canopy and tree. And like their cats basically live outdoors, but in a cage. It's super weird. But I just thought it was super fun to show off because we do treat that tree. We try to make sure it's healthy and safe because losing this tree is not an option. It's basically literally a structurally important piece of the cat run. So obviously a lot of us probably have more interesting trees at like historical sites and things we manage. This one I just thought was like, this guy takes this tree as seriously as a 100-year-old oak tree outside of an estate or something, like it was really funny to me. So I like this one as an example. And then the last tree, basically this guy called me out because he thought his pine had disease. It was going to spread to all the other white pines, and we had to do everything we could to save this tree. And the only picture that I really had in my, from a distance was the one on the left where it's like, yeah, that looks like kind of a diseased pine, I guess. But the guy was a do-it-yourselfer contractor and spent months building a house just off to the side of this tree, and you can see all the tracks in the ground. So, I mean, he swore that there's no way he could have damaged this tree, but come on, man, like I can see your excavator tracks. Like I did humor him and I sent samples to the U of M to see if there was any disease, and they kind of laughed at me. But this is just a good example of like site influences on this property, and don't just go by a picture and start being a Google arborist where you're trying, because it was worth a long drive up there to chat with the guy because he was super nice. And this was just a small white pine. He had a whole forest of these massive white pines. So he had real reason to be concerned about preserving the white pines as a whole. But obviously this guy was a goner. So basically, that's it for my presentation. I have a few final thoughts. It's just basically, again, reiterating that this course isn't enough to give you all the overview of tree risk assessment. I think it's definitely worth paying for that course and having somebody who's like doing tree risk assessment fully as a consultant do the training. That's the people that they have do the TRAQ course. So I definitely feel kind of humbled by this topic because like I don't feel like I'm a true tree risk assessor, but when I spent time studying for this, I started to realize how much I'm doing tree risk assessment every day. So I think that should be factored in whether you decide to do TRAQ or not, because I don't think it's just about getting that extra, plaque for the wall. I think it's a really valuable, just because I don't take that systematic process super seriously doesn't mean that the TRAQ course isn't important. Like I said, the TRAQ forms that are available to you are not a tool that I keep handy, but I still think they're worthwhile learning. And especially for the people that will actually run with those forms. There's probably people watching who are like super pissed at me for saying, I don't fill those forms out, but I've never met any arborist that does, besides the ones that do tree risk assessment for their job. So my job is being a practical arborist. That's probably the majority of the audience here today. And so my closing thoughts are basically like, you should just definitely give the course a chance. And it lasts for 5 years, so I think it's worth the value. You get a lot of CEUs for the time, so that do go towards your ISA certification. So if you're missing CEUs and you need a good course to take, go take the TRAQ course. So that's it. Are there any other questions for me?
Questions? If you can hear me, that is.
Yeah.
I know they can hear me. I know I sound like a chipmunk to you for some reason, but
Yeah.
How important is it to be subjective with your diagnoses that you do?
I think a lot, like when I talk about gray area, I guess I mostly mean subjectivity. Like I think it's just like with tree gear and like tree climbing and this whole industry and chainsaws, like for every arborist, there's going to be a different opinion. That's where being knowledgeable and skilled and learning from a lot of people helps in this type of work, because I'm not just pulling my feeling about a tree out of my butt. Like I'm going by experience and what I believe is the physics and real things that's going to happen to the tree. So I'm being as objective as possible, but the part of me which is like I'm just a normal guy, basically I have subjectivity about how I feel about the tree and what they should do to the tree. But if I can stay objective, that's better. And the TRAQ forms are really objective. Like if you take the TRAQ course, you'll find it's pretty deadpan. Like there's no real room for like BSing. There's just it's going to be specifically, here's what's going on, here's the way you should mitigate it, here's the time frame in which I think you should do that. And if you don't do that, then that's potentially a negligent situation. So I don't know. Again, I just think it's worth, especially for someone hiring. I don't get too mad when they say, "Oh, I have another guy coming to look at it." It's like, okay, good. Like, get more opinions if you need to, but I'll give you as honest and applicable, practical solution as I can for this tree. Yeah. Well. Oh yeah. Sorry. Yeah. So you could advertise that as a service, and you just got to be upfront with the client. Like, you might have to do a few test runs, like especially after you get tree. Well, just having TRAQ and putting that on my card, or like through the ISA website, people have found me through the Find an Arborist function on treesaregood.org. So you literally just have that right next to your name every time. I put it on my business card. It's on the end of every email. It's not, I don't really fully advertise it, so I guess I don't know how I'd approach that. It's just something that it can start really casually from just basically, hey, I want you to look at my trees, to informing a client, hey, this tree risk assessment needs to be done. I require X number of dollars to do that, so it's going to happen a little bit organically. But you could straight up just make a flyer or make a Facebook post or something on your company's page and say, we offer tree risk assessment. But I know it's really tough to do that when a bunch of guys will go out to a property and basically do that for free. Like it's the same way I feel about doing tree inventories. Like I get really annoyed when a company will inventory an entire property, like, and that's just saying like a residential property, like a homeowner association or something like that. they do it for free when that's valuable work they put in. They just gave a ton of data to that client. You should get, compensated for that time, I think. But obviously, sometimes that service of doing tree risk assessment is going to lead to work. So maybe you just say, hey, I'm going to charge you this many dollars for this report. But if you end up going with me for the tree pruning or tree cabling, whatever, I'll credit that towards a future service. So I don't know exactly how to advertise it beyond just your normal, hey, I cut trees, I do plant healthcare, I do tree risk assessment. So just add that in as your bullet points on your card or advertisement. Okay. Yeah.
Sorry, I was talking
Yeah.
and you guys couldn't hear me.
Oh, that's cool.
Thank you, Casey, for coming out and sharing your knowledge with us, taking your time out of your busy day. Thanks, everybody, for watching. If you are here to get your 2 free CEUs, I've posted the link to the quiz in the comments as well as in the video descriptions. So you can go ahead and start taking that. You do have to get 16 out of 20 questions correct to do that. So, so good luck on that. I hope you were taking notes. But once again, thanks, Casey. Do you have anything you want to plug? Do you want to tell them how to get to your YouTube channel?
Yeah, just a couple last comments. Like I just have a couple last slides here. Saying basically special thanks to Tree Stuff for having me out. It's really fun. You guys kind of picked this topic for me, so it's kind of actually a challenging topic. But I think it was really worthwhile doing. Obviously, the International Society of Arboriculture. My wife was super patient with me, taking way too much time to put this presentation together. Then just, the regular folks, everyone who's watching, that kind of stuff. Anyone who kind of has taught me or contributed to my success in this field. On the next slide, you can just find me at YouTube or on Instagram, are kind of the most common places where I'm online. So if you need to reach me, that's probably the easiest platforms to get a hold of me. Otherwise, maybe in the next Tree Stuff webinar, you can talk to me then too. Otherwise, if you're in Minnesota, come and talk to me in person.
Yeah. If you're in Minnesota, go find him. If you need his address, we can get that for you somehow. I don't know.
Sure.
We're definitely going to be trying to have him back. So thank you very much, and have a nice night, everyone.
Thanks.